Schwartz, Tropical Babylons, Sugar in the Making of the Atlantic World, 1450 to 1680. I'm going to be reviewing his work in this book, his methods, and his thesis. He challenges the William thesis using staple theory in the book, and the book is mainly about sugar. Uh, to start out with, he goes through the history of sugar quite extensively throughout the book, from Sanskrit, the earliest Indo-European language family in Asia, throughout the Mediterranean, through Europe, through the Canaries, Madeira, Barbados, through Brazil. And quickly, I'm going to go through and say the sounds that were used for the word sugar. Sanskrit was sakara, Arabia was sukarin, French was sucre, German was Zucker, and then back to India it became Shuga, and then sugar. I found that interesting enough to include it. The reputation of Stuart Schwartz is he's the history professor at Yale, focused on Latin American studies for 28 years. He just retired in April. They had a party and a lot of cool speakers. I read the list. In his own words, quotation, Yale is a kind of center for Brazilian studies. We have one of the best collections of Brazilian materials, end quote. The president, Richard Levin of Yale, said that, quote, perhaps the most outstanding scholar of Brazilian history, end quote, in the world. So he has a good reputation. He has worked with a lot of people in Latin American studies as students. He's had a lot of students that he's taught, PhD students. He's written extensively. He has a work in 2008, 4 years after he published this work, that was given a long list of awards. He lives in Connecticut. He's married to a Puerto Rican woman who is a lecturer in Spanish and Portuguese at Yale. Let's see. His online presence is very minimal. He had a Brown University lecture that he gave on Beyond Sweetness, a keynote address, and it was really good. I watched the whole thing. It was interesting. And he also had a video presentation on Blood and Boundaries, a 2020 book that he released that was also pretty good. Interesting. He went through some of the things that were in this book as well. He went to Columbia University in New York in 1968. He published his books with several great places like Cambridge University Press and Yale. And then this book was published at University of North Carolina Press. So obviously challenging the Williams thesis meant that he might not be able to publish with Cambridge. That might have been the reason, we can only assume. The book, what it's about. The book is a look at the sugar industry and slavery in the 15th, 16th, 17th century in Latin American Atlantic history. Each location is researched and written about by a different author, and it's all to add up to prove that staple theory can be used in this instance. And again, it goes through Iberia, Portugal, Western Europe, Mediterranean, India, Africa, the Canaries, Cuba, Jamaica. It's quite extensive in the places that are mentioned. Then that show how, quote, sugar gradually became a commodity almost as essential as salt, cheese, and grains. It also shows in the book that not just as a trade, like circum-Atlantic history, but it shows cis-Atlantic history in some instances where the doubling and tripling of populations on islands, and there were new cultures and new norms. The thesis is, again, the Williams thesis challenged. Capitalism and Slavery by Eric Williams, 1944, has, as Schwartz says in the first line, become, quote, commonplace, end quote. Sugar production in the 15th century is a story that has been often told in its implications for the interwoven history of peoples on the continents of Europe, Africa, end quote. And also, quote, the Williams thesis has been an issue of considerable debate and controversy. Right or wrong, his vision of the late 18th century, when about 90% of the West Indies' value to Europe was from sugar, has been read backward in time, so that even from its origins to the production of sugar and combination of the various factors that went into its making have been viewed as a foundational capitalistic enterprise, end quote. And that's really his thesis right there. Right or wrong, he's wrong. He's saying that he's wrong. He's definitely saying that he's wrong. So, and then he also says that the way in which he's wrong is looking backward in history, which pretty close to the definition of pseudo-history. So, pretty strong argument, despite coming at it quite softly in wording. Then he immediately is doing his, due diligence and justice to the other side of the argument, and he quotes Karl Marx in favor of Williams' thesis, where Marx says that, quote, the turning of Africa into a warren of commercial hunting for black skins, and also, quote, rosy dawn of the era of capitalist production, end quote. So he doesn't shy away from showing that there is valid perspective to the Williams thesis. Quite honestly, over and over again throughout the work, there's a lot of really good valid perspective for looking at it through the Williams thesis perspective. I don't think that this is a challenge necessarily to do this, prove it, or rather a challenge to say that there should also be another perspective to look at. And then in chapter 1, Schwartz goes on to list things like Cuba was socialist, the 15th century, quote, the 15th century in a feudal society in the Mediterranean, end quote. Spain wasn't a capitalist society. So Schwartz mentions it that these were the precursors to factories and companies. They were, quote, the forerunners of the modern industrial units of the capitalist world, end quote, on page 3. So he admits that these things are right, but he's also looking for something else, another perspective added to it. And the arguments are for the fact that there was social status, land ownership, there were other defining characteristics other than private property and profit, there was status, services, goods, there are a hierarchy within religion and different societies, and they didn't record profits very little. They weren't as concerned with making capital, and so he also includes, I believe it's like called philology, where he talks about the word plantation is not used. It's in Gingho, in most of these islands in the beginnings, it's not a plantation. A plantation is something entirely different to Schwartz. Then in Gingho, and there should be a difference noted. Also, he uses neologism and the fact that he states that the people who lived in that time didn't define their time as the thing that we define it now, but that's done over and over again throughout history without issues, so I don't see the point. But on page 6, Schwartz introduces the staple theory. It's a theory based from Canadian economic departments concerning Canada's history and its resources, its commodities, its exports that led to its growth. I understand where he's trying to look at just an individual perspective, slightly askew within staple theory, but it works. I think staple theory would work best if we were talking about Spain or Portugal and the Canaries and Madeira right there next to it, or India and its local. But he does have to adjust it a little bit, I think, to frame it in the Atlantic view, but it works. He goes on to say that it's a useful tool for the local populations that were utterly wiped out, and that it enables, quote, it enables us to cross imperial and colonial boundaries, end quote. The chapters in the book are papers to, quote, be used to test a staple theory approach. And staple theory is defined as by Schwartz as after economy is diversified, it is difficult. Well, after economy is diversified, it is difficult to measure the effect of a single staple, and that staple theory may be, the right approach for these populations that grow naturally. Quote: when populations grow naturally, meaning not as a result of increased immigration or forced importation, and call for a model far more complicated than the one contained in staple theory and its market. So I'm not sure that he really agrees that staple theory works either, but he does want to use it as a useful tool in its context. What he really wants to point out is that whenever using slavery, capitalism, and sugar as a whole and grouping it together within the Williams thesis, what often happens is, quote, the historiography of the early sugar economies is simply not as full or as well developed as that of the latter ones, end quote. So he really wants to just look for more precise details, it seems, within Latin American history instead of grouping it all together. He wants to separate what Americans called people from what Latin Americans called people, whether it was mulatto or whether it was half-breed or whether it was a plantation or an Ingenho. Wants there to be a clear separation in that. And towards the end of the chapter, he says that, quote, these chapters are beginning in a newer, more nuanced vision of the origins of the Atlantic economy and the role of sugar within it, end quote, page 20. And then there's this short ending where he says, quote, Babylon became the symbol of the social ills and inequalities of Western society and in the sugar colonies of the Atlantic world. The origins of those societies were inextricably intertwined with the legacy of slavery, plantations, and sugar. This volume seeks to trace that history and demonstrate its complexity. And then he mentions Bob Marley and I think Jimmy Cliff for that. So he must have been in his late 20s, 29, 1968, or early 30s. And so he listened to Bob Marley, and somehow this is incorporated into that, a Babylonian system, and he calls them tropical Babylons. And I'm kind of curious what he means by that. I've heard Bob Marley's music. I knew what he was referring to in some sort, but I wanted to get some clarification, so I looked it up. And Babylonian system means any system of corruption of any kind that limits freedom, anything, whether it be police or churches or schools or political systems or, whatever you have. But then it also includes quite a more extensive perspective, quite a different perspective. It seems to say at first that the philosophy that it holds is that there's no class, there should be no judgment of skin color, and there should be equal rights. And then that makes sense. But I wonder, does the author also hold the extended view, the more far out, quote, you can't educate us for no equal opportunity, and the Survival album 3 years later, or the album a year later in Uprising, where he says that, quote, emancipate yourself from mental slavery, end quote. And so there's a view that somehow like anti-slavery, slavery, all that, the whole view, the whole perspective is part of the same thing. You have to pull yourself out of that entire view as a perspective. And I don't know if the author means to head towards that or not. It doesn't really, I don't think, answer the question anywhere throughout the book whether or not he is referring to either one or both. But it is a question. The chapter 1, I felt like he was asserting staple theory in some form and the way he framed it will work to be a good tool for Atlantic history and challenge the William thesis as being the only way to look at history, with the assertion that it has some pseudo-historical inaccuracies that persist because of its use. And then in some way, he may be saying that the perspective of the Williams thesis falls into the Babylonian system or racial thinking as a whole. And so, to give an example, it would be like, who was it? Morgan Freeman said that he didn't want to celebrate Black History Month in 2005 because he just didn't want to do it. He said there's no reason to do it. Black history is American history, I believe is what he said. And then he said he didn't want people to refer to him, and I have the quote. He said, I'm going to stop calling you a white man, and I'm going to ask you to stop calling me a black man, quote, to Mike Wallace. And I feel like that's what the embodiment of this is. Is it that perspective that goes beyond race? And are you saying that we shouldn't even do anti-slavery history? And really, there's no evidence that he's saying that in the book throughout, I don't think. I think, like I said already, the book is a great representation of Williams' thesis, and you can learn a lot about what happened in slavery from the book. So I don't think he's going that far. I think he's just saying that tropical Babylons in general he's meaning that these are different systems: capitalism, socialism, feudalism, and all of these different systems are doing the same thing. They're oppressing people through the Babylonian system, but they're not the same thing. They're not all capitalism. They're not all plantations. They're different forms of oppression, which doesn't make it right in any way. And he never tries to justify it ever or use any bad terminology in any of his work. So, yeah, I think he's just trying to say that it's more intricate and we should look at it in a more intricate matter because he has a lifelong dedication to Latin American history. That's what I get so far. Chapter 2, Sugar in Iberia. Author William Phillips Jr. provides a great historical background to the sugar's history from its discovery onward. The thesis is reiterated in, quote, historians of sugar have paid relatively little attention to the story of labor, and historians of slavery have seldom concentrated on sugar, end quote. And also, quote, Iberia was home to the societies with slaves, not slave societies, end quote. So, in conclusion of Chapter 2, the sugar industry did not have its start in Iberia, Latin America. Latin America was simply a small production that happened to become the way station between ancient sugar cultivation in Mediterranean and India and the new colonies, as well as the continuation of an already existing slave trade that existed that everyone took advantage of. So it may seem like there's a little bit leaning towards blame avoidance in the thesis, but I don't think I can prove it. But Chapter 3, Sugar Islands, the sugar economy of Madeira and the Canaries, 1450 through 1650, Alberto Vieira. This 42 pages. There's nowhere where Vieira shifts into a thesis for staple theory or has a thesis. He doesn't conclude with any sort of mention of an argument or any point. He just jumps right in to talking, and it's a great paper. It's impressive. It explains a lot. It's well done. It really does show that you can do staple theory. I mean, he hit the mark. You don't have to talk about it. You can just talk about sugar and slavery and what happened and not give an overarching conclusion or argument. Chapter 4, the sugar economy of Hispaniola in the 16th century. Genaro Rodriguez Morel. Morel tells a similar story, but now the enterprise has moved to Haiti and the Dominican Republic, where Hispaniola, There's some raiding of Bahama Islands for natives. There's killings. There's enslavement. There's privatization of land. But he uses a staple theory throughout. So it is well done. It does show that it works. Chapter 5, Sugar and Slavery in Early Colonial Cuba. Alejandro de la Fuente. The thesis is reiterated and more focused and stated clearly. He says, quote, the lack of serious empirical research about this period has led to sweeping characterizations about slavery and sugar in colonial Cuba, end quote. And he proves his point, and he provides good points. He says slavery and sugar in colonial Cuba, is, like lacking evidence, but I can't remember what he actually said. Oh yeah, that's right. Hold on one second. Chapter 5. Sugar and Slavery in Early Colonial Cuba, Alejandro de la Fuente. The thesis is reiterated more focused and stated clearly. He says, quotations, the lack of serious empirical research about this period has led to sweeping characterizations about slavery and sugar in colonial Cuba, end quote. But I felt like he missed the mark for me. The entire chapter is focused on slavery and less about sugar. It's an argument and challenge to Williams' thesis, but he doesn't get really into doing staple theory as much. Chapter 6, A Commonwealth Within Itself, the Early Brazilian Sugar Industry, 1550 through 1670. This is by Schwartz, Chapter 1 and Chapter 6 for the book. Schwartz writes Chapter 6, well, the story of slavery, sugar, plantation owners in Brazil, fighting with the Dutch, pirates. It's a beautiful story. He does a great job. There really is nothing I could say to critique his. He did it perfectly well. He could have just written the introduction and written Chapter 6. Chapter 7. Chapter 6 should be a movie, honestly. But Chapter 7, the Atlantic slave trade to 1650. Herbert Klein. Now, Klein drives headfirst into the history of slavery. Quote, from the 6th century BC until the 8th century AD. Klein speaking on Muslims owning slaves for domestic work since 800 is showing that it was somehow normalizing it, or showing that it existed for a long period of time in the Mediterranean and other regions. And overall, I felt like an odd choice, but still, it was done within circum-Atlantic perspective. It was well written. And Chapter 8, the expansion of the sugar market in Western Europe, Eddie Stoll's. I felt like this was a great example of the staple view, and it was a fun paper on sugar-filled cakes and jellies, an introduction to the creation of the bakery industry as more than just bread, but cakes and preserves made with sugar instead of honey. The author does a fantastic job. There's a lot of breadth to the food knowledge. If you're into the food industry, I think you would enjoy this paper. It has so many cool details. Side topics on things like the generation of employment and all the different intricate jobs that had to be done for just, making Dutch letters, which you can still get today in Iowa and Fairfield and Pella. And I've had them. They're fantastic. I can't get sidetracked by sugar. Chapter 9. The Sugar Industry in the 17th Century, a new perspective on the Barbadian Sugar Revolution, in quotations. John McCusker and Russell Bernard. I think the chapter is best summed up by the author's conclusion. Quotation, this essay contends that the idea of a singular revolution is misleading when applied to Barbados. The prices of slaves also recorded at the very end is like the end conclusion to the book, pretty much. But what he is really saying is that there wasn't so much as a revolution caused by sugar as a revolution per se at that time caused by the investments made by the British just at that specific moment into Barbados. And that mainly the sugar revolution should be called a sugar boom, which was a good side argument and didn't talk about anything to do with the Williams thesis per se, but it was a good show that you could use staple theory to talk about things, intricate things within it. And it ended with, and I couldn't help but look it up, the price of 1644 slaves in Barbados when slavery just began with just 3 to 6 slaves per in Genho or small plantation. The price was 21.35 to 30 pounds sterling, or $8,521 to $12,175 US dollars. And then, not 1644, but 1658, when there were plantations with 100 slaves, the prices declined a little bit and steadied out at 7,000 to 10,000 US dollars, almost exactly 7,004 to 10,007. Now, the conclusion is this: the author seeks to better define Latin American history and history in general surrounding the Williams thesis. Because history is so complex and filled with nuance that the evidence that staple theory can provide us with is within the framework of cis and circumatlantic historiography. It'll work well to expand our knowledge of Latin American history, pretty much. I think that whenever the authors do the staple theory, that they do it well, and it's great reading. However, anytime when it was explained well as well, but it felt like it's like a little bit cringe, just explaining it while you're doing it this way or having to justify doing it. And I don't know why, but there were some low moments for me where I was like, okay, I can see where somebody will say this, but I think that they're just taken out of context. So I could never see any way in which this was like anti-slavery. But I could also see where a few people would be like, well, what do you mean justification? Or what do you mean only 2 or 3 slaves? Or why specifically do you have to blame shift and say that Americans said half-breeds and someone else it wasn't said mulattoes? What was the evidence for that? Did they both say mulatto? Did you mean that it's less wrong and like so forth and so on? And like, what's the point of this? But I think overall, the author, the point is to expound Latin American history. And then he brings this key philosophical position to the argument to show that it's even more complex is the Babylonian system of thinking, where maybe we're overgeneralizing everything. There was different systems, again, socialism, capitalism, feudalism. There wasn't just one thing. There were different forms of hierarchy and class systems, religious status, social status, family groups, bloodlines, throughout all of it. And he was pretty much saying that there was a highway of slavery and injustices long in practice and practice long after, and harsher conditions for greater number than early history of slavery in Latin America, which does seem like a little bit blame shifting, but still. does a good job within the framework of staple theory. He also did a good job to frame in the Babylonian system thing, and it brings to question whether or not the way we frame things matters. Does the way we frame things continue a form of thinking that's negative, even though it's meant to be positive? Which is what I questioned about reading this and why it's even being produced the whole time. I had the same question. And I think both theories, my own personal opinion, I think both theories are true. William's thesis is a great perspective and way to look at history, and I also think that staple theory is a wonderful way to look at history. I enjoy both. I think both are useful. And, both are worth everyone's time. Thank you.